So this next section is going to be focused on the 1920s. Flappers, hair bobs, short dresses. The 1920s roared for a reason. Now the decade was not all fun and games. You would think so, because soldiers were coming home. But the end of the war shut down production at many factories, since guns, bullets, uniforms, and the like were no longer needed. There was a movement to go from wartime to peacetime production. With the sudden arrival of soldiers looking for work, women were forced to quit the jobs they had filled for the last 2 to 3 years. The same patriotism that drove them to work was now supposed to drive them to quit. Many factories were forced to shut down because they were no longer producing war goods. The government had canceled contracts. Overall, low pay and few jobs led to mass unemployment. In fact, by 1921, 12 million workers were unemployed. That's equivalent to about 1 out of every 8 Americans could not find work. Now, those that struggled greatest were not often in industry. In fact, farmers were the first to struggle. After the war, European countries began to grow their own crops and no longer needed food exported from America. The European markets, in other words, shut down. Many farmers lost their jobs and their farms because of overproduction. They had, during war years, they were producing at max production levels, maximum levels. They had taken out loans to buy maximum everything that they needed. More tractors, more land, more facilities. But the dropping prices for farm goods and this overproduction led to many farmers losing their ground, losing their farms. The government tried to help, but many programs either didn't work or were instituted too late. Now, unrest was everywhere, in the factories, the fields, and the streets. Strikes spread across the country as unions protested working conditions, wages, and long hours. Now, unions had fallen silent during World War I. It was unpatriotic to challenge that. But now we're looking at something different. We are in production mode, and we're not in war mode. So there's a change, and unions challenge that. Strikes occurred everywhere, from coast to coast. Seattle shipyards, Boston police, and even Pennsylvania scare. Now, most of the strikes failed, as the public withdrew their earlier support. Company owners used the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia as an example of what could happen in America if unions gained power. Most Americans came to believe that labor activists were Bolshevik agents, communists. Some believed that communists, or Reds, were everywhere. Eugene Debs led the Socialist Party, which supported collective ownership of industry by non-violent means. He believed in the people owning the companies, but he believed in non-violent measures. Immigrants faced a lot of problems. Many refugees from Eastern Europe were suspected of treason due to the sudden rise in strike activity. A rash of bombs in 1919 across 8 U.S. cities further intensified the Red Scare. That April, 36 bombs were found in the mail addressed to government and business leaders. One was meant for Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. Palmer immediately placed J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI on the case, and thousands of suspected political radicals were arrested in the Palmer raids. Most arrested were immigrants, who were immediately deported. Unfortunately, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were not so lucky. These two Italian immigrants, who were anarchists, they believed in no government, were accused of murder and robbery outside a Boston shoe factory. Eyewitnesses to the crime, eyewitnesses who could offer alibis, were dismissed. Sacco and Vanzetti had a very short, most would say unfair trial. They were sentenced to death and were executed. To this day, there is little argument or little substantial evidence proving that Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty of this crime. So what did the workforce look like? Well, college enrollment grew. World War I veterans returned home and chose life in the cities and universities instead of returning to farms. Many of this was because their farms had been lost by their parents, but others wanted better opportunity. Graduates entered the financial fields, financial service jobs. They went to bank jobs. With less government interferences, businesses began to thrive, and many people were earning more money than they had ever made. The standard of living increased during the 1920s, and people had disposable incomes. They had additional money to spend on additional items. Women began entering the workforce in traditionally male roles. So some women left the workforce, others maintained their jobs. These roles were taxi drivers and pilots. The 1920s in the United States served as a turning point to many of those entering the workforce. Now, all of this was possible due to a concept called laissez-faire. The economy was struggling to move to production normally seen during times of peace, and a series of 3 Republican presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, promoted a concept of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is a French term literally meaning hands off. In this form of government, businesses were allowed a greater freedom to operate without government interference. Government stays out. According to Warren G. Harding, President Harding, more business in government, less government in business. And Calvin Coolidge continued that idea with the chief business of the American people is business. These 3 presidents did little to control the economy of the 1920s. They believed that the private sector, privately owned companies, could control themselves. The government did not need to interfere.
The chief business of the American people is business. The man who builds a factory builds a temple. The man who works there worships there. President Calvin Coolidge.
President Coolidge's now famous words indicate the almost religious faith that many Americans placed in business. The gospel of business told Americans of all backgrounds that prosperity would bring about fulfillment of the American dream.